He was just a janitor, the man nobody remembered by name in that gleaming glass tower. But that evening, he asked to leave early for the first time. Just for a date. The CEO looked at him, her gaze so cold the entire conference room fell silent. "Someone like you has a date?" Those words changed everything. No one knew that the quiet man had spent 3 months silently saving the entire company from a disaster. Even the CEO herself hadn't noticed. And that evening, he decided to stop saving it. The 32nd floor of Viridian Capital's headquarters smelled the same every night. Recycled air, fresh printer toner, the faint chemical ghost of carpet cleaner. Daniel Hargrove had memorized that smell the way other men memorized their commute. It was the smell of invisibility. He pushed his cart through the corridor at 9:17 p.m., the wheels making a sound that nobody in the open plan office looked up to locate. The analysts had their headphones on. The senior associates had their eyes locked on dual monitors, fingers working across keyboards in the particular frantic rhythm of people who believed their urgency was unique. Nobody looked at Daniel. Nobody had looked at him in 11 months. He was 38 years old, 5'11", lean in a way that came from skipping lunches, not from discipline. His hair was light brown going gray at the temples, cut short because he cut it himself every 3 weeks over the bathroom sink. His eyes were a steady gray-green that tended to read as brown in most lighting, which suited him fine. His badge said, D. Hargrove Facilities Services. The badge was the only text in the building that acknowledged his existence. In 11 months, he had learned the geography of invisibility with the precision of a naturalist studying camouflage, which postures made people look through you rather than at you, which speeds of movement registered as background rather than presence, which hours of the night left the building's social geography emptied of its usual politics. After 9 p.m., the 32nd floor belonged to the ambient sounds of the machines and the muffled urgency of the people who had decided, at some point, that staying late was the same as being important. He stopped at the end of the corridor, near the server closet, and stood there a moment with his mop handle resting against the wall. To anyone watching, and no one was, he appeared to be reading the cleaning schedule clipped to his cart. In reality, he was listening. The server closet hummed. It always hummed. But tonight, the pitch was slightly different. A fraction higher. The kind of variation a man would only notice if he had once designed the cooling architecture himself. He pulled out his phone, not the cheap prepaid one he used for calls, but a slim personal device, older model, scratched along one edge and opened an app that showed no icon anyone would recognize. He looked at it for 4 seconds, then put it away. He resumed mopping. At 9:44 p.m., he detoured through the executive wing. It was quieter there. The carpet was thicker, and his cart made no sound. He passed the frosted glass wall of the main conference room and did not look inside. He didn't need to. He could see her reflection in the dark window across the hall. Evelyn Carter stood at the head of the conference table with one hand resting on its surface and the other holding a tablet angled slightly toward her chest, the way a person holds something they don't intend to share. She was 32, with the kind of controlled stillness that came from spending a decade training herself out of every nervous habit. Dark blonde hair pinned back, a charcoal blazer that cost more than Daniel's monthly rent. Her face in profile was sharp, not pretty in any soft sense, but compelling. The face of someone whose attention, when directed at you, felt like a searchlight. She was speaking. He couldn't hear the words through the glass. He moved on. At the end of his shift, 11:00 p.m., technically, though he rarely left before 11:30, he unlocked the small equipment room on the building's second basement level. It was his in the way that institutional spaces become temporarily personal. He knew where every switch was in the dark, which shelf wobbled, which fluorescent tube took 20 seconds to warm up. He sat on a metal stool, opened his scratched laptop, and worked for 40 minutes before shutting it down and putting it back in his bag. Then he took out his phone and looked at a photograph. A girl, 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding a handmade card that read, "Happy Birthday, Dad," in letters that varied dramatically in size. Her name was Lily. She had her mother's hair, dark and wavy, and Daniel's eyes, that uncertain gray-green. She was staying with his sister Clara while he worked nights. It was an arrangement that worked. He told himself this regularly. He put the phone away, gathered his things, and walked out into the parking structure. The security guard at the desk, a young man named Marcus who worked the overnight, looked up. Night, Dan. Night, Daniel said. That was the full extent of his social life on most evenings. It was a Tuesday in February. The kind of pale, flat afternoon that arrives without character and departs without being noticed. Daniel was on the 12th floor at 4:15 p.m., an unusual hour for him, since his shift didn't start until 6, but he'd come in early to check a ventilation issue that had been logged by the morning crew. He was finishing up near the east stairwell when he encountered Patrice Okafor, the senior executive assistant who served as the unofficial traffic controller for the entire C-suite. Patrice was efficient, kind in a professional way, and had once, about 6 months ago, remembered to tell Daniel that someone had spilled coffee near the third-floor copy machines before he'd walked straight into it. He had not forgotten this. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, checking something off on her tablet without breaking stride. He stopped. The fact that she'd used his name registered distantly. "Miss Okafor," he said. She paused, tilting her head slightly, the look of a person who has just noticed something slightly out of order in an otherwise predictable environment. "You're in early," she said. "Ventilation on 12. He adjusted the strap of his bag. "I wanted to ask, would it be possible to adjust my schedule tonight? Leave at 9 instead of 11? Patrice studied him with the calm, assessing expression of someone whose job required constant evaluation of requests for their ripple potential. "Personal reasons? I have somewhere I need to be." She didn't ask more. Most people in her position would have. "I can check with building management," she said. "The thing is, Miss Carter has a late session running tonight, the Meridian Systems Board call. And she's asked for the executive floor to be maintained through at least 10. I can make sure the floor is clean before 9, Daniel said. Patrice considered this. "I'll pass it along." He nodded and resumed walking. He didn't expect to hear anything back. He had made the request because Lily had her school play rehearsal that evening. The one she'd been talking about for 3 weeks, the one she'd described in such precise and breathless detail over every dinner they'd managed to share that Daniel had the entire plot memorized. She was playing a tree. She had made this announcement with a solemnity that suggested she considered it the tree role. At 5:52 p.m., he received a message from an internal facilities number. "Miss Carter would like to speak with you before shift. Conference room 3, 6 p.m. He read the message twice. Then he changed into his uniform. Conference room 3 was the large one, the one with the long table, the wall of screens, the view over the city that made people feel important. At 6:02 p.m., it contained Evelyn Carter, her CFO Garrett Finch, 2 senior vice presidents, whose names Daniel knew from the company directory he'd once read out of professional habit, and Patrice standing near the door with her tablet. Daniel walked in. He was in his uniform, gray work shirt with the Viridian Facilities patch on the sleeve. He was carrying nothing. He stood near the door, not at the table. Evelyn Carter turned from the window and looked at him. It was the first time, in 11 months, that she had looked directly at him. He met her eyes and waited. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. Her voice was precise, calibrated. "Patrice tells me you've requested a shortened shift tonight." "Yes." "To leave at 9. "Yes." The silence stretched half a second longer than necessary. One of the SVPs shifted in his chair. Garrett Finch was looking at his phone. "You're aware," Evelyn said, "that this is a significant operational evening. The Meridian call runs until 10. The executive floor needs to be—" "I can have it done by 8:45, Daniel said. She studied him. He got the impression she was deciding something, though he couldn't tell what. "You're leaving," she said slowly, "for a personal engagement." "Yes." A pause. And then softly, precisely, in a tone that was not cruel, but was something adjacent to it, she said, "Someone in your position has a date." It was not a question. It was an observation delivered with just enough weight to make the room feel it. The SVP nearest the window pressed his lips together. Finch looked up from his phone briefly, then back down. Daniel did not change his expression. "I've completed the standard checklist for the executive floor," he said. "The boardroom, hallway, and restrooms are done. I can have the conference corridor finished by 8:45, as I said. If that's acceptable, I'll be on my way at 9. If not, I'll stay until 11 as usual." Evelyn Carter looked at him for a moment longer. Then, "You'll stay until 11. He nodded once. He turned and walked out. In the hallway, he stopped, took out his phone, and looked at Lily's name on the screen. It was 6:08 p.m. The rehearsal started at 6:30. His sister would be there. She would tell Lily something that he was working, that he'd tried. Lily would understand. She was 8, and she understood more than she should have had to. He put the phone in his pocket without calling. He pushed his cart toward the conference corridor and began to work. At 6:31 p.m., his phone buzzed. He felt it against his hip and did not take it out. The first sign appeared at 7:15 p.m. Daniel was near the end of the second corridor when he heard the change in tone from the IT room, a room he passed every shift, a room whose operational hum he had learned to read the way a doctor reads a patient's breathing. The fan pitch increased, then a soft alarm, the kind IT teams configure to be quiet so it doesn't disturb the floor, began its patient pulse. 1 beat every 4 seconds. Steady. Unacknowledged. He had written that alarm himself. He had set its threshold calibration personally, during the original build, with the specific intention that it activate early enough to allow response time. 4 years ago, standing in this same room with access to the full administrative console and a legal mandate to be there, he had thought, "This alarm gives you 40 minutes. It was a gift to whoever came after him. He was watching them spend it. He didn't slow his cart. At 7:22 p.m., 2 members of the IT team, both young mid-20s, the kind of technical hires who'd grown up building on cloud architecture and had limited direct hardware exposure, came out of the server room with expressions that tried to appear controlled and failed. "Is there a problem?" Patrice appeared from the direction of the executive corridor. "Minor routing issue," said the taller one. A young man named Owen, whose badge Daniel had read while cleaning adjacent to his workstation for the past 11 months. "We're looking at it." Patrice went back to the executive wing. Owen and his colleague went back into the server room. Daniel pushed his cart to the supply closet at the far end of the floor, unloaded his mop bucket, and sat on the edge of a shelf. He took out his personal phone. He opened the app. He looked at it for longer this time, nearly 2 minutes, his face perfectly still, in the way of a man reading something he already expected to see. The indicators were amber, probing, not penetrating. The gap was being tested with careful, methodical pressure from the outside, the signature of someone who had studied the architecture and knew precisely where to push. This was not opportunistic. Someone had been watching this system the way Daniel had been watching it. From the outside, patiently, waiting for the moment when the person quietly maintaining its integrity stopped doing so. He closed the app. He picked up his mop. In the conference room, behind the frosted glass, he could see the shapes of people in conversation. The Meridian call. Evelyn Carter at the head of the table. Her posture the same as it always was. Upright. Centered. Giving nothing away. She had a tablet in front of her and was speaking in the controlled, unhurried cadence she used when she was making the other people in the room feel that the situation was more manageable than it actually was. He had watched her in that room many times, from corridors, from reflections, from the peripheral awareness of a person who had learned to observe without being observed. He had watched her run late meetings with the precise authority of someone for whom failure was simply not a variable she'd permitted into her calculations. He had also, once, at approximately 11:45 p.m., on a Wednesday in December, seen her sit alone after everyone had left, with her jacket off and her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the window. And he had recognized the expression on her face because he had seen it in his own bathroom mirror for most of the previous year, the look of a person enduring the private cost of what they did in public. He had not forgotten it. He had not thought about it often. He had simply not forgotten it. He wondered sometimes what she thought about on the drive home. He suspected it was work. He suspected it was always work, because the alternative that the drive home was the only quiet she permitted herself was a thought he declined to finish. He resumed mopping. At 8:40 p.m., Owen came out of the server room again. This time, he was on his phone, his voice low and tight. "Can't isolate it. The traffic's wrong. It's coming through the authentication layer, and we don't have the original documentation to—" He disappeared around the corner toward the executive wing. Daniel stopped mopping. He stood in the empty corridor for 3 full seconds. The soft alarm from the server room pulsed once behind the closed door. Then again. The fluorescent lights held their steady, indifferent light. He thought about the 40 minutes. He thought about the gap, and the 3 weeks he had let the patch sit unfiled. And the specific decision he had made, not in a moment of anger but in a moment of tired, clear-eyed arithmetic when Evelyn Carter had said someone in your position in that quiet, precise voice, with the conference room full of people who had not looked up from their phones. He thought about Lily, about the tree, about the second line she had almost forgotten and recovered, only because the other tree had whispered it to her from stage left. He put the mop in the cart. Then he pushed his cart to the closet, locked it, and walked toward the exit. 11 months ago, when Daniel Hargrove had walked into the Viridian Capitol building for the first time in his new capacity rolling cart, gray uniform, facilities badge, he had been in the building before, not as a janitor. He had built the authentication system that Owen was currently failing to isolate. His actual name in the industry was Daniel Hargrove, but 7 years ago it had been prefaced by a title that appeared on conference programs and grant acknowledgments: Principal Security Architect. He had spent 4 years at a defense contractor, 2 years consulting independently, and then been recruited by Garrett Finch, who was then VP of Infrastructure, not CFO, to design Viridian's entire security and data governance architecture from the ground up. He had done it. 18 months of work. A system he was quietly proud of, layered, adaptive, with fail-safes that most people in the company didn't know existed because that was the point of a fail-safe. He had presented it to the board. He had overseen its implementation. And then his wife, Rebecca, had been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. The 6 months that followed were not a period Daniel thought about in linear terms. They existed in his memory as a series of images without narrative. Hospital parking structures, the particular blue of a waiting room chair, the sound of Lily asking if Mommy would be better for her birthday. Rebecca died on a Thursday morning in April, with Daniel holding her hand and Lily asleep in the chair beside the bed. He had taken bereavement leave, and then more leave, and then Garrett Finch, who by that point had consolidated his position into the CFO role with the assistance of a board who appreciated his financial aggression more than his ethics, had presented a restructuring proposal in which Daniel's role was eliminated as part of a security outsourcing initiative. His work would be maintained by a third-party vendor. The credit for designing it would migrate, in all future internal communications, to Finch's department. Daniel had not fought it. He had a daughter who needed him present. He had a severance package. He had, somewhere in his depleted reserves, a quiet fury that he'd had neither the energy nor the desire to express through corporate channels. He had, instead, done something that Finch had not anticipated. He'd accepted a facilities position at the same company. The reason was simple. The system he'd built had a flaw, a single architectural gap he'd identified 3 months into his absence, when he'd had enough clarity to think again. A gap Finch's outsourced vendors had not found because they didn't understand the system well enough to look in the right place. If that gap was ever exploited, the consequences would be severe. Data exposure at scale. Regulatory liability. The kind of breach that ended companies. He had stayed to watch it, to maintain it quietly, to fix what needed fixing from the only access point available to him. A janitor's badge, a personal laptop, and 11 months of being the person no one watched. He had filed 17 patches in that time, each one through a ghost account that would trace, eventually, to nowhere obvious, each one closing a vector he'd identified from the outside. using techniques that required understanding the architecture at a level only he possessed. And now, as he walked out of the Viridian Capitol building at 8:51 p.m. on a Tuesday in February, he was leaving one unfiled. He picked Lily up from his sister Clara's house at 9:22 p.m. She was awake. She was often awake past her bedtime on nights she was with Clara, who had a more relaxed relationship with schedules, and she ran to the door when she heard his car. "You came," she said, which was what she always said, and which always did something to his chest. "I came," he said. He crouched down, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. She smelled like popcorn and Clara's shampoo. "I was the tree," she said into his collar. "I had 3 whole lines. Clara recorded it. I'll watch it tonight," he said. "You can watch it right now," Clara said from the doorway. She was 3 years older than Daniel, with their mother's eyes and their father's directness. She had been the one who had sat in the hospital parking structure for 3 days during Rebecca's last week, who had driven Lily to and from school for 4 months after the funeral without being asked, who had never once used the word cope in Daniel's presence because she understood that it was not a helpful word. She looked at him now with the practiced assessment of someone who had developed a precise instrument for reading her brother's face. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "You look like someone ran over your car." "I'm fine," he said again. He stood up with Lily still hanging from his arm. "Thank you for tonight. Every time," Clara said. And she meant it. He drove home. Lily talked about the tree roll for the full 20 minutes of the drive, covering its dramatic requirements, its physical demands, the moment when she had nearly forgotten her second line and had stared out at the audience so long that the other tree, Marcus apparently, a classmate of debatable commitment, had whispered it to her from stage left. Daniel listened. He asked questions. He laughed once, genuinely the kind of laugh that came without preparation, the kind that still surprised him when it arrived. He did not check his phone. He had made that decision somewhere on the drive to Clara's, in the flat gray of a February night, with the city lights smeared across the wet road. Not a decision born from anger. Exactly more from a recognition of arithmetic. He had given the company 11 months. He had given it 17 patches and 1,000 hours of quiet vigilance. He had given it the architecture that made it function. He had been thanked for none of it, acknowledged for none of it, seen for none of it. And then, when he had asked for a single evening, not a raise, not acknowledgement, not the restoration of the title that had been taken from him, he had been told, in a conference room full of witnesses, that a man in his position presumed too much. He understood that Evelyn Carter had not intended cruelty. He had watched her long enough to know she was not a cruel person. She had been distracted and dismissive, and she had said something reflexive that she probably would have chosen differently if she'd been paying attention. People said things like that all the time. They said them to the people who brought their coffee and cleaned their floors and fixed the things they could not fix themselves, because those people were not, in the ordinary accounting of a busy day, quite real. He was tired of being not quite real. At 11:08 p.m., after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and opened his personal laptop. He opened the monitoring app. The screen showed what he'd expected it to show since 8:40 p.m. Read, the authentication layer had been breached at 9:54 p.m. The intrusion was systematic, not opportunistic, not random. Someone had known where to push. The unfiled patch was, as he'd designed it to be, the most accessible remaining gap in the system. Not obviously the weakest point, but the weakest point for anyone who understood the architecture from the inside. Which meant whoever had pushed through it had been studying the system with an intimacy that suggested either a former employee or someone who had paid a former employee for their knowledge. He looked at the cascade of red indicators for a long moment. The breach was still active. In the IT room, Owen and his colleagues were almost certainly staring at the same data with the specific paralysis of people who had been handed a piece of machinery they didn't fully understand and were now watching it fail. Garrett Finch, who had made the decision to replace Daniel's ongoing oversight with vendors who operated from documentation that was, by design, incomplete. Finch was somewhere in this city. perhaps already receiving calls, already beginning the process of constructing a narrative in which the failure belonged to someone else. Daniel looked at the red indicators. Then he closed the laptop. He finished his coffee. He washed the cup. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment, looking at the small drawing Lily had taped to the refrigerator. Two figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of something that might be a house or might be a tree. "Me and Dad" was written beneath it in the varying letters of a child still working out the relationship between intention and execution. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. That was honest. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house, Lily's small breathing through the wall, the furnace, the particular creak of the third floorboard in the hallway that he kept meaning to fix, and he looked at the ceiling and thought about the 40 minutes, about the alarm he had designed, and the gap he had left unfiled, and the 2.1 million records he suspected were now visible to someone who had no right to see them. He had not wanted this outcome. That was also honest. He had wanted an evening with his daughter. He had wanted to watch a small girl in a tree costume deliver 3 lines with the solemnity of a method actor. He had wanted to be the father who showed up, not the father who was always indispensable somewhere else. Both things had been true at once, and the building had not made room for both. At some point, he slept. By 10:30 p.m., the Viridian Capital trading platform had taken 400,000 records offline. By midnight, the figure was 2.1 million. By 2 a.m., when the first emergency board call assembled via video voices thin with sleep and sharper with fear, the breach had touched every client-facing data layer the company operated. Evelyn Carter was on her 4th phone call by midnight. She sat in her home office, which was meticulously organized, and which she had occupied for the better part of every night for the last 2 years. And she felt, for the first time in those 2 years, that the ground beneath her feet was not solid. "How long has it been compromised?" she asked. "We're still mapping it," said Owen, whose voice had moved well past tight and into something quieter and more frightened. "The intrusion point is in the authentication layer, but whoever did this knew the system. Knew it. This isn't a standard attack vector." "The vendors," Evelyn said. "They're on it." But a pause. "The thing is, there's something weird in the patch history. Someone's been maintaining this system. Not the vendors. Someone else." "What do you mean, someone else?" "There are patches filed from an account that's not in our vendor contract. Goes back about 9 months. Advanced stuff. Really targeted. Whoever it was, they were plugging holes before we knew they existed." Silence on the line. "And tonight's breach," Evelyn said carefully, "is through a gap that doesn't have a patch. The only gap left unfilled." Another pause. "It's almost like whoever was maintaining it stopped." Evelyn Carter sat very still. At 1:15 a.m., Garrett Finch appeared on the video call from what appeared to be a hotel room. He had the look of a man who had been asleep and wished he still was, but beneath the fatigue there was something else, a tightness around his eyes that Evelyn, who had spent 2 years reading rooms for a living, noticed and filed away. "The incident response protocol goes through the vendors," Finch said. "We've already escalated to Tier 1. The vendors," Evelyn said, "are the ones who missed this. That's not established." "Garrett." Her voice was quiet. "Level. Someone has been filing patches to our security architecture for 9 months. Not the vendors. Someone else. I want to know who, and I want to know in the next 2 hours." Finch said nothing. At 3:40 a.m., Evelyn received a message from Owen. "Ghost account traces to internal building access. Facilities. Level credentials. I need you to see the log files." She looked at the message for a long time. Then she looked at something she had not thought about since it happened a moment 6 hours ago. A man in a gray uniform standing in the conference room doorway without expression while she'd said something she would not have said if she'd been thinking more carefully. "Someone in your position has a date." She got dressed. The IT room at 4:15 a.m. had the particular stillness of a place that had been busy for too long. Empty coffee cups. A whiteboard covered in diagrams. Owen at his workstation with the posture of someone operating on adrenaline and spite. Because spite was the only fuel that still worked. He pulled up the log files without preamble when Evelyn walked in. 17 patches, he said. Filed between April of last year and 2 weeks ago. All of them through this account. He pointed to a credential identifier on the screen. Took me a while to trace it because it's routed through a building-level access point. Maintenance tiers. Evelyn looked at the screen. The building access point, she said. The second basement. There's a terminal down there, basic. Not supposed to have network-level access. But whoever this was modified, the permissions on it. Quietly, in a way that would only make sense if they understood the entire architecture. Owen paused. Like the person who built it. Evelyn was already looking at the building directory on her own tablet. Facilities, services, staff. 12 names. She scrolled to H. D. Hargrove. She stared at it. Pull his employee file, she said. Owen did. There was a pause while they both read. The file was sparse, the kind of sparse that comes not from a person having no history but from a person whose history was somewhere else, in a different system, under a different title. Date of hire. Previous employer listed as independent consultant. References unverified, because facilities hires went through a third-party staffing agency that did not conduct deep background. I need the company's original architecture documentation, Evelyn said. The security system design files. Who authored them? Owen pulled the directory. They both looked at the author field for a long moment. D. Hargrove, Principal Security Architect. March, 4 years prior. The room was quiet. The server fans cycled steadily. Outside the one window that faced east, the sky was beginning the specific, dark blue shift that preceded dawn. He built it, Owen said, carefully, in the tone of a person confirming something that didn't require confirmation. He built it, Evelyn said. She stood up. Where is he now? Owen checked the shift records. He called out sick yesterday. No, wait. He didn't call in. He's just... A pause. His badge was deactivated this morning at 7 a.m. Building management logged a voluntary termination. Evelyn was already walking to the door. The address in the employee file was a 30-minute drive from the building, in a neighborhood of modest single-story houses with small yards where the grass was dormant and brown in February. Daniel's house had a concrete porch and a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. There was a bicycle against the porch, railing a child's bike, pink. With training wheels recently removed, the screw marks still visible on the rear axle. It was 5:47 a.m. Evelyn sat in her car for a moment before getting out. She was aware that she looked like exactly what she was. A person who had not slept, who had driven across the city before sunrise, who was about to knock on a stranger's door, or a man who had once worked for her, or both. She got out. She knocked. A light came on inside. Footsteps unhurried, the footsteps of someone who had heard the knock and was approaching without alarm. The door opened. Daniel Hargrove stood in the doorway, in a gray t-shirt and jeans. He was barefoot. His hair was slightly disordered from sleep. He looked at her with an expression that gave away nothing, which she was beginning to understand was simply his default state. Behind him, from a back room, a child's voice. Dad? Who is it? Nobody, Lil, he said. Without turning, go back to sleep. A pause, the rustling of a small person rolling over and complying. Then, quiet. Evelyn Carter, who had held boardrooms without visible effort, who had stood in front of investors and regulatory panels and competitive threats without losing her equilibrium, stood on this man's porch and found she was uncertain how to begin. Daniel watched her. You found the log files, he said. Yes. How bad is it? 2.1 million records. The platform is down. We're looking at regulatory notification requirements. She paused. It could have been worse. It could have been contained entirely, he said. 3 weeks ago, I filed a patch that would have closed the last gap. I let it sit, unfiled. Because of last night, he said nothing. Which was an answer. Evelyn looked at the bicycle against the porch railing. Then at the man in the doorway. You designed the system, she said. Yes. And Finch restructured you out of it. A slight pause. You knew about that? I didn't, she said. I do now. His restructuring proposal came through before I took this role. The documentation attributed the architecture to his department. She said this steadily, because the alternative was to let the anger she felt about it show, and she was not ready to do that yet. I should have looked more carefully. Daniel leaned against the doorframe. His arms were crossed. Not in a confrontational way, more in the way of a man standing in the cold who has not bothered to put on a jacket. Why did you stay? She asked. Because I built it wrong, he said. There was a gap I found after I left. I wasn't going to let someone else pay for my mistake. It wasn't your mistake. It was an architectural limitation that required ongoing maintenance. I built the architecture. She looked at him. The sky behind her was shifting now, that particular flat gray that precedes February sunrise, without drama or warmth. I said something last night, she began. You don't have to. I do. Her voice was quiet, but firm. It was the voice she used when she was saying something that she meant to stick. What I said was dismissive. It was wrong. I was focused on the operational evening, and She stopped. Restarted. There isn't a good reason for it. I'm sorry. Daniel looked at her for a moment. His expression had not changed, but something in it had shifted, a slight softening. Or perhaps just a relinquishment of wariness, the way a person stops bracing for a blow when it becomes clear it isn't coming. I don't need an apology, he said. I've heard worse. That's not the standard I want to be held to. A pause. A very small, brief thing moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. I need your help, she said. That's the honest reason I'm here. The platform is down, and nobody else in that building understands the system well enough to fix it. She paused. But I also needed to say what I just said. Both things are true. He was quiet for a moment. My daughter wakes up at 7, he said. I take her to school at 8. It's not yet 6, Evelyn said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. Coffee's on, he said. The kitchen was clean and small. There was a drawing on the refrigerator, 2 figures, one tall, one small, and a child's backpack hanging on a hook by the door, with a small keychain tree attached to the zipper. Daniel filled 2 mugs, without asking how she took hers, and set them on the table. He sat down across from her. She wrapped her hands around the mug. Outside, the street was quiet. The neighborhood still mostly asleep, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had both spent years in rooms where silence was a negotiating position, and who were currently using it simply as a pause. If I come back, Daniel said, it's not as a janitor. No, she said, obviously not. I want independent oversight of the security architecture. No vendor interference, no departmental chain of command except directly to you. If I find something, I fix it. I don't run it up 3 levels of approval first. Agreed. And I want a facilities audit. He said this flatly, without heat. The people in that building, who do what I was doing, the ones nobody looks at. I want to know their names, their actual skill sets, their compensation. Because I promise you there are others. Evelyn looked at him. Others, she said. People who ended up somewhere smaller than where they started. For various reasons. He held her gaze. The building runs on them. The building has always run on them. The difference is that most of them don't have the specific leverage I had. So they just continue being invisible. I don't want that to be a policy that continues by default. She nodded slowly. I'll commission the audit, and I leave at 5. Every day. He said this last part, without apology, with the calm simplicity of a person stating a fact about the physical world. My daughter has school. I'm not negotiating that. Fine, she said, and she meant it in the way she meant the other things, not as a concession, but as a recognition of something she should have already known. He looked at his coffee. Finch knew about the gap, he said. Not the technical details. But he knew the outsourced vendors were operating with incomplete documentation. He made a decision to accept the risk rather than acknowledge that the original architect's work was still active in the system. A pause, because acknowledging it would have complicated the restructuring narrative he'd constructed. Evelyn's hands tightened slightly around her mug. "I'll need documentation," she said. "I have it," he said. "Log files, access records, the original restructuring proposal with the attribution discrepancy. I kept copies." A pause. "I kept copies of everything." She nodded. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the February sky was just beginning to lighten, not warm, not dramatic, just a gradual and patient brightening, the kind that didn't ask to be noticed. "How long did you know?" she asked. "That I was the CEO. About 3 weeks in," he said. "I saw your name in a directory. I didn't connect it with the woman running the board calls until I heard someone use it in the hallway." He paused. "You don't perform being in charge. Most people in that building are performing it constantly. You just do it." She looked at him. "That was an observation," he said. "Not a criticism." "I know," she said. And then, because she was a person who did not permit herself evasion even when it would have been easier. "Last night, in the conference room, you don't have to. I do." She looked at him directly. "I wasn't thinking about who you were. I was thinking about the operational schedule, and I said something reflexive and unkind. The fact that I wasn't thinking about you is precisely the problem." She paused. "That's not an excuse. I'm just trying to be accurate about what happened." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to say," he said, "that most people aren't cruel. They're just not paying attention." She thought that was worse. He looked at his coffee. She was usually right. The kitchen held that for a moment. "I don't need you to be sorry," he said. Finally, "I need you to be different." "Which is harder?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is. At 6:48 am." Daniel Hargrove opened his laptop at the kitchen table while Evelyn Carter made calls from the small porch, her voice low and steady, managing the crisis with the methodical precision of someone who had found the bottom of the problem and was now climbing out. She communicated clearly, without drama, allocating responsibility and authority in the same breath. He could hear her through the window, and he thought, "She's good at this." She was genuinely, technically good at it, in the same way he was genuinely, technically good at what he did. And perhaps that was the only honest territory they shared, the specific satisfaction of a problem, correctly solved. He worked for an hour and 4 minutes. His fingers moved across the keyboard in the unhurried way of a person who is not trying to impress anyone, who is simply solving a problem because the problem is there, and he understands it better than anyone else alive. He filed 2 patches. He rerouted the intrusion traffic into a contained loop that would allow forensic analysis without continued data exposure. He sealed the gap, the one he had left, unfiled with the particular care of a person repairing something they had originally built, and still, despite everything, did not want to see broken. At 7:52 a.m., Viridian Capital's trading platform came back online. The regulatory damage would take weeks to manage. The legal exposure would require careful navigation. Finch would be walked out of the building 3 days later. After the documentation Daniel had kept was reviewed by outside counsel, and the board was given a private briefing, the investigation would be quiet, as these things usually were, and its conclusions would be characterized in the press as a restructuring initiative. But the platform was up. At 7:59 a.m., small footsteps appeared in the kitchen doorway. Lily Hargrove, 8 years old, hair in 2 uneven ponytails that suggested she had done them herself, regarded Evelyn Carter with the direct assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise her curiosity. "You're not Clara," Lily said. "No," Evelyn said. "Are you a friend of Dad's?" Evelyn glanced at Daniel, who was watching this exchange with his coffee mug in both hands, and the expression of a man prepared to be neutral, regardless of outcome. "I work with your dad," Evelyn said. "I came to ask for his help." Lily considered this. "Did he help?" "He did." Lily nodded, apparently satisfied with the transactional logic of this. She looked at her father. "Can I have the cereal with the blue box?" "Yes," he said. She disappeared into the pantry. Evelyn looked at Daniel. He was looking at the pantry doorway, with an expression so unguarded that it was almost difficult to look at directly the expression of a man for whom the small, ordinary moment occurring in front of him was the full measure of what mattered. Not the platform, not the breach, not the vindication of 11 months of invisible work. The cereal with the blue box. The gap-toothed girl making her own ponytails. The keychain tree on the backpack by the door. Evelyn looked away. At 8:07 a.m., Daniel Hargrove walked his daughter to his car. Lily wore her backpack and carried a lunchbox shaped like a rocket ship, and she held her father's hand across the driveway with the unconscious confidence of a child who has never been given a reason to doubt that the hand would be there. Evelyn stood on the porch. She watched them go. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate. And she had learned, over years of being in rooms where the wrong words cost more than silence, to prefer silence. She had also learned, in the last 12 hours, that silence was sometimes not restraint but simply the appropriate response to something you didn't yet have language for. The car pulled out of the driveway and turned down the street and became, after a moment, indistinguishable from the ordinary Tuesday morning traffic of a February city waking up. She stood on the porch for another moment. Then she took out her phone and began to make the calls that the morning required. 3 weeks later, the internal communications policy at Viridian Capital was updated to include a provision requiring name recognition protocols for all facilities and support staff. Every employee at every level would be addressed by name. Every badge would include a preferred name field. Building management briefings would include support staff, headcounts, and skill inventories. The policy memo was brief and administrative, and was characterized internally as a compliance update. It was, to anyone paying attention, something slightly different. The facilities audit, commissioned by Evelyn Carter and conducted by an outside firm over 6 weeks, returned 43 names: former engineers, a retired network administrator, a woman who had spent 12 years as a pharmaceutical research assistant and was currently managing the building's HVAC scheduling system with a level of precision it had never previously achieved. People who had arrived at smaller versions of themselves and continued doing the work anyway because the work was there and they understood it. The audit report sat on Evelyn Carter's desk for 3 days before she read it in full. When she finished, she sat in her office for a long time without doing anything else. The security architecture review was completed in 30 days. Daniel Hargrove's name appeared in the final report's authorship field, in the primary position, attributed correctly to the original build date. The attribution discrepancy in the previous documentation was noted in an appendix that no one in the press ever read, and which everyone in the building eventually understood. He left the building every day at 5. On a Thursday in March, at 4:58 p.m., Evelyn Carter passed the security architecture office, a real office now, with a door and a window, and a whiteboard covered in diagrams. Only one person in the building fully understood, and saw Daniel Hargrove pulling on his jacket. He had a bag over his shoulder, and he was reading something on his phone, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who was already somewhere else in his mind, somewhere smaller and warmer, and not professionally important. She kept walking. He was always on time for pickup. The tree, according to Lily, had been the very best part of the whole night.